Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I think they're in the
Can
back.
you hear me all right without a mic? Yeah. All right, awesome. Let's get this out of the way first. It is sad about Yogurtopia, though it is amazing that Yogurtopia lasted as long as it did to me. Let's be honest. It's fake yogurt or fake ice cream in a state where we have like 6 weeks of summer. So like, shout out to Yogurtopia defying the odds and making it much longer than they should have. Did anyone pick Yogurtopia as the place where they would eat with their historic figures? No. You should have. It was your last chance. It brought it back. Anyway, I'm Wayne. Like Rachel mentioned, I preach at Parkside Church of Christ, which is a church about 2 miles from here, 1.5 miles, up Ford towards an Outer Drive area. Before working there, I used to work for Intervarsity for 5 years, so I love coming home to all of you. I love being here. So thanks again for welcoming me. What is your favorite part of a wedding? For some people, it is the moment that the bride appears at the end of the aisle. For others, it's the look on the groom's face. For other people, though, the best parts don't happen until the reception. Like when the bride's dad does his welcome to the family speech, or when they cut the cake, or have their first dance, or toss the bouquet, and inevitably one of the girls jumps out of the way as to not catch it. That was my girlfriend for a long time. We did get married. It worked out. I don't know what it is. Anyway, I think that all of those moments are great, I guess, but none of those is my favorite. My favorite part of a wedding comes later in the night, once the dancing begins. And this isn't because I love dancing or because I am a good dancer. I don't, and I'm not. But there's this one thing that happens, at least at every wedding that I've been to, every one of my family's weddings, even though it's never on the schedule, and I just absolutely love this moment. It goes like this. The bride and groom have their first dance, and then there's the mother-son, daddy-daughter dances, and then the DJ says something like, now let's really get this party started. Turns up some upbeat pop song, and everybody, especially all the younger people, rush out to the dance floor and start doing their Cupid shuffles and their cha-cha slides and their flosses or Fortnite dances. I don't know. I'm old, all right? And the parents and the grandparents and aunts and uncles, and more often now me, watch with amusement and kind of mingle with each other until maybe 6 or 7 songs into the night, when the music suddenly changes to The Hustle or Dancing Queen or Footloose. And all of the college friends and the cousins roll their eyes and they take a break to go get a drink and catch their breath. And as the crowd thins, you see a handful of men and women rushing towards the dance floor, forming an entirely different dance circle. These men and women in the middle of this room are just dancing their hearts out. And in the very middle of all of that are the father and the mother of the bride and groom busting some of the corniest dance moves that you've ever seen. The dads are all doing this thing, you know? And the moms are doing something like this, like, and they are grinning ear to ear and like you've never seen them grin before, and they are just so happy, so proud of their babies, so happy to be among all of their family, and so relieved that all of that wedding planning is over. This is my favorite moment at any wedding because there really is nothing like it. These people who you are so used to seeing act like mature, proper adults are suddenly transformed into giddy teenagers, swept away by this wave of pure celebration. There is no better picture of true joy than parents dancing badly. Our story for today, which many of you read already, is all about that kind of joy, which is actually kind of a surprise, considering the fact that this story starts with grumpy church people. At the beginning of Luke 15, some of the religious leaders see the crowds of people flocking to Jesus and begin to grumble among themselves, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Now, if you have been reading through Luke from the beginning, by the time you get to this point, this observation is really old news to you. After all, Jesus welcoming people and eating with them is one of the central themes throughout the entire Gospel of Luke. This, according to Luke, is what God's hospitality looks like Jesus eating with sinners. And this isn't a new complaint for the religious leaders either. They keep bringing this up. In chapter 4 of Luke, they chased Jesus out of town for extending God's hospitality to their enemies. And in chapter 5, they complain about Jesus eating and drinking with tax collectors. In chapter 7, they call Jesus a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of sinners. And then later in that same chapter, they scowl at him for welcoming a supposedly sinful woman at the dinner table. And again, in the story immediately after this one, they will mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." Over and over, it is the same scandal, the same complaint. Among his religious community, Jesus' hospitality is the main point of conflict in the Gospel of Luke. It's the reason Jesus has enemies. This time, though, when they raise this complaint, Jesus doesn't reply with some witty saying or proverb. Instead, he tells a trio of stories, including one of the best known and best told stories in the Bible. He saves that one for last, though. The first story he tells is about a shepherd. And this shepherd has 100 sheep in his flock, but one day he realizes that one of his sheep has gone missing. So he leaves the rest of the flock where they are and heads out to look for this lost sheep. Eventually, he finds it, and when he does, he is filled with joy. He carries this lost and found sheep back home on his shoulders, and when he gets back, he throws together a party and invites all of his friends and neighbors. "Come celebrate with me," he says, "because I have found my lost sheep." This is a weird story. It's such a typically Jesus story that you probably missed just how weird it is, but it is undeniably pretty weird. Think of it this way. How would you react if you were one of this guy's neighbors? You're sitting at home, minding your own business, when there is an enthusiastic knock at the door. So you get up to check to see what's going on, and you find your neighbor bouncing up and down with this big smile on his face, and he says, "I am throwing a party tonight, and you are invited. Come celebrate with me." Great! You say, "Hey, what are we celebrating?" "One of my sheep went missing this afternoon, but I went out and found him. Oh yeah!" I don't know about you, but my first thought would be something like, what's the big deal? This guy lost one of his many livestock for like a couple hours, and then he found it again. This thing must happen all of the time, right? So why is he so excited? Of course, I'd still go to the party, because who's going to pass up a free party? But still, I don't think that even at the party, I would understand why exactly we were celebrating. I mean, I guess I'd be happy to see my friends so happy, but I'd still think it was kind of strange. Jesus' second story is also kind of strange, in my opinion. And again, I might be the only one who thinks this way. I've done a lot of reading about this passage, and I haven't found any other scholars or preachers who agree with me that these stories are weird. But still, put yourself into this story and tell me it's not unusual. Again, this story ends with somebody throwing together a party and inviting her neighbors over. So again, there you are at home, and the doorbell rings again, and this time it's the lady from across the street, and she is just as excited as the other guy when she says, "I am throwing a party. Come celebrate with me." All right, you say, although you're still a little bit worn out from the last party. "What are you celebrating?" "I have found my lost coin," she says, smiling. "Oh," you say. "You lost a coin?" "Yep, just a few minutes ago. I had 10 drachma, but somewhere along the way I lost one of them in my house. So I lit a lamp, and I got on my broom, and I started sweeping under all the furniture until I heard a little clink, and there it was, my lost coin. So yeah, grab all your stuff and come on over. It is time to party." Again, you'd probably go, but you are still not going to be sure why this party is even being thrown, especially when you consider how little this coin was really worth. It would be like somebody losing a 20 and then later on finding it in their pocket and then throwing a banquet to celebrate. Or like somebody finding a temporarily lost sheep and then throwing a party. Either of these two, these two people both saw some value in their sheep or in their coin that I'm just not seeing, or they are just really easily excited, ready to party at the slightest provocation. Jesus' third story is a lot longer than the first two, and a lot more detailed, but the majority of it also takes place at a party. Let's have a feast, the main character says at the climax of the story. Let us have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost, but now he's found. Finally, a good reason to throw a party, right? After all, what is more deserving of a celebration than a lost, dead son being found alive? Except, I'm not so sure that this guy's neighbors would have seen this as a party-worthy event. See, this long-lost son disappeared on purpose. The last time any of them saw him was when he marched right up to his dad and demanded to be given his inheritance early, basically telling his father, to quote Mr. Potter from It's a Wonderful Life, "You are worth more dead than alive." Despite all the dishonor it would bring to both him and his family, this son ran off with his father's money and made himself a stranger. Until one day, that stranger comes limping back down toward the road to home. His plan had totally backfired. He is now broke and hungry and humiliated. And when you think about it, this is his father's chance to get his revenge, to teach this kid a lesson and to restore his honor in front of all of his friends and neighbors. This son would wander up to the door and beg his father to come back home, even just as the lowliest of his servants. And his father would reply, "I'm sorry, I don't know who you are. We are strangers now. Remember? We are dead to each other now. Remember? Now, get off my porch." That's how the story should go. Instead, it goes like this. The man sees his humiliated son in the distance, and he hikes up his robes, something a man never does, and begins to run, something else a man never ever does. And when he reaches his son, he gives him a big hug and a big kiss, two more unthinkable acts of unbridled joy and acceptance, things that nobody in his culture, and really nobody in any culture in this situation, would ever do. Before his son even has a chance to apologize, he is being welcomed in the most affectionate way. He clears his throat and begins to beg for mercy. He's been practicing this speech for a long time. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But his dad at this point clearly isn't even listening. He cuts off his speech by turning to his servants and shouts, "Quick, bring my best robe and the family ring and some good sandals and put them on my son." And he tells them to kill the fatted calf, which, considering the fact that most of the time this family didn't even eat meat at their meals, is a sign that this is a very special occasion, and a public one too. It takes a village to eat the fatted calf. This image here is a cross between a wedding reception and a block party. Everyone is invited, everybody's partying. Or, in the words of this story, "Let's have a feast and celebrate," he says. So they began to celebrate. And this must have been some party, too, because according to the next verse in the story, even in the fields, you could hear both music and dancing. I'm not sure exactly what dancing sounds like, but I'm pretty sure that we'd recognize it if we heard it. This is how this estranged son is welcomed home. Not with angry punishment, not with public shaming, but with a giant over-the-top dance party, with the son as the guest of honor and with his father as the giddy dancing host. Nothing is more joyful than parents dancing badly. Nothing is more joyful than God's hospitality. After all, this whole story is about God. All three of these stories are. I tell you, Jesus says at the end of the first story, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 persons who don't need to repent. And again, at the end of story number 2, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. He doesn't repeat this line again after the third story because he doesn't need to. But we should have figured it out by now, right? God welcomes people home joyfully and extravagantly. And nothing sets off God's party reflex like one of us returning home. Maybe God sees something in us that nobody else sees. Or maybe God is just really prone to celebration. Maybe it's a bit of both. But if there's one thing that Jesus wants these grumpy religious leaders and us to see in these stories, it's that God's hospitality is extraordinarily joyful. I remember reading this story with a student at DePaul University in Chicago back when I was working for Intervarsity. Let's call this student Mike. Mike had come to my Bible study week after week for over a semester now, sometimes dragging along friends and even strangers with him as he came, which surprised me considering the fact that Mike was not a Christian. He was, by his own description, an atheist and kind of a grump. And he loved reading the Bible with us. The day we read this story, he was the only one who showed up to small group, so I asked him when we were done, who in this story reminds you of yourself? The runaway son. Totally, he said. Only before he went back home. I asked him if, he wanted to go back home. And he said, no, not really. But thanks for asking. A couple weeks later, Mike sent me a text and asked to meet with me. So early in the morning, I got up and went to campus, and he told me this story. Last night, he said, I was having a hard time falling asleep, so I started to clean up my dorm room, and I grabbed my Bible to put it away, but instead, I opened it up to the book of John. Now, I've been reading the Bible with you all for months now, but this was the first time that I felt like it was written not just to you, but specifically to me. I started crying for no reason, and I called some of my friends from small group and asked them to come over. Soon, 5 students had joined Mike in the middle of campus, and with his hands shaking, Mike said, I think I'm ready to start following Jesus now. Each of his friends prayed for him. They had been praying individually for months now. And then Mike prayed for the first time. I was way too excited to go back to bed, Mike told me. So we all ran down to the lake. Remember, this is in Chicago, right on the shore of Lake Michigan. And we all were singing and praying as we went. And we were out till like 5 in the morning, dancing on the beach and shouting in the streets. And everybody probably thought we were drunk. But I've just never felt so happy before. To what can I compare the hospitality of God? It's a midnight beach party for a friend rescued by Jesus. It's a banquet thrown for a sheep. It's a stay-at-home mom proposing a toast to a rediscovered coin. It's 100,000 angels high-fiving and fist-pounding and chest-bumping. It is Jesus at a dinner table with strangers. It's a dishonored father turning a stranger into a son with music and dancing that echoes into the fields. And it's in those fields that we find the father in the next scene in the story, sweaty and out of breath, smiling but worried as the music and laughter continue back home. He's come out here to find his son, not the runaway from before, but the older brother, the good son, the one that never left, the one that refuses to go to the party. Which is a pretty big deal, because in their culture, the oldest son was supposed to co-host all the family events, especially parties like these. Everybody would be looking for this guy, expecting him to be standing there next to his dad, welcoming his brother back home. But instead, he's in the field, openly refusing to set foot in the house, publicly humiliating his father. This seems to be a trend in this family. Look, the older son shouts, loud enough for anyone to hear. All of these years, I have been slaving away for you and never once disobeyed any of your orders, yet you never gave me even a little goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property on prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him. With everything this son says and does, he makes it clear that he doesn't consider his father's party to be his party. If his dad and brother are inside living it up, then he will stay outside, thank you very much, even if doing so deeply insults his father, even if doing so essentially tells the world that family isn't my family. For the second time today, his father has an opportunity and a right to reprimand this estranged son, to demand obedience or to repay rejection with rejection. But of course, that's not what he does. That's not what he's like. That's not who he is. Instead, he offers an invitation. We had to celebrate and be glad, he explains, because your brother was lost and now is found. My son, he says, you are always with me. Everything that I have is yours. In other words, this party isn't just his father's party or his brother's party. It's his party too. And the only thing that would make his father's joy complete is if he came back home and joined in the celebration. And that, I think, is our invitation tonight as well. Come in and enjoy the party. And maybe you have been away from God for a long time. You took what you could get, and you ran off, and you did God knows what. And maybe that thought scares you, that God knows what you've done, and where you've been. Maybe you have been afraid to turn back and head home because you don't want to face God's reaction. And if that's the case, here is the good news for you tonight. God's reaction is pure joy. Your return home would set off a party. You are the source of God's joy. And if you've been part of God's family for a while now, you've been faithful and worked hard, but you found yourself distant from this celebration, you've put so much work into being a good kid that you don't even like the idea of spending time with your screwed up siblings. You'd rather be grumpy outside than join Jesus at the table with sinners inside. Then there's good news in this story for you too. You are still welcome inside. This party is your party too. God is inviting you to be his guest, to join in this feast and to help host others, to welcome other people back home to God. The party has already started. We can hear it even out in the fields. The table has been set and is waiting for us, and to all who is near and to all who are far, the Father and the Son and the Spirit say, come. Would you pray for me? God, we hear your invitation tonight. We can't not. We can't miss it. Whether we are on the road far from home, or throwing a pity party in the fields, or dancing with you somewhere inside the house, we hear your invitation constantly repeated, constantly echoing in our hearts, to come, to join in, to participate in your life, in your joy. It's hard to accept that. It's hard to follow you. It's hard to accept your invitation. But more than anything, it's hard to accept that you find sincere joy in us. And yet those of us who have put our faith in Jesus confess, even when it doesn't seem true, that you would find such joy in us that you would leave everything else behind, search in the darkest corners, hike up your robes and run to us, even when we made ourselves strangers from you. That you find such deep joy in us that you would become one of us, die for us, and rise to set us free. That's a hope and a celebration that we're only now beginning to imagine. And I pray for each man and woman in this room, especially for those who are personally wrestling with your invitation, eager to respond and yet hesitant. I pray for that invitation to be clear and compelling. For all the talking that we've done tonight, I ask simply for your Spirit to speak to us, to invite us to come, to join you, and to make your joy complete. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.